I'm Marco Vollmer. I'm member of the board of the International Journalists Programs, IJP, and I would like to introduce to you my colleague, Eka.
My name is Eka Neumann, and I'm the coordinator of the African program of the International Journalism Program, and I'm super excited to hear today from and learn from today's panelists.
Our topic of today, COP26, climate change hits Africa with full force. What needs to be done? Heat, floods, landslides, the consequences of the climate crisis are being felt particularly strongly on the African continent. With a share of only 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, Africa remains the region with the least pollution, but also the one that receives the least international climate funding. On COP26, the International Climate Conference in Glasgow, the global climate community has discussed, debated, and finally agreed on a compromise. If it's a strong or weak compromise, maybe we will find out in this call. But many questions nevertheless remain. How can renewable energies be rolled out more broadly? What role does the energy sector play? How should the industrialized countries contribute and support? How can the needs of countries of the global south or the global majority be given more consideration? We want to find answers on these questions with our distinguished guests of today.
So, and these guests are Shido Muzondo, Policy Advisor of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Vian Musica, Renewable Energy Manager of Ecological Christian Organization. Then we have Dr. Garrett Hansen, Program Director, Climate Change at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. And we have Julia Blocher, Doctoral Researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIC. Welcome to everyone.
Let's start with our first guest and our first input, Shido Muzondo. She's a policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. This is an independent think tank championing sustainable solutions to 21st century problems. Their mission is to promote human development and environmental sustainability. Shido's research interests include just transition to renewable energy, low carbon mobility, and addressing climate change in the global south. Based in Joburg, South Africa, she holds a master's degree in environmental change and management from the University of Oxford, and she has 6 years of experience working in urban development, sustainable transport, energy, and climate change. And she was in Glasgow, and she has attended the COP26 a week ago. And Shido, I would like to hear from you. What is your conclusion on this year's COP26?
Thank you, Marco and Eka, and thank you for having me. I think I was quite optimistic going into COP26, but what we saw come out, as has already been said, was more of a compromise than I think we need at this moment in time in terms of the state of the climate. For example, we know that when you take into account all the new NDCs or the net zero pledges, which are submitted before COP, we're looking at warming between 1.8 degrees Celsius to about 2.4 degrees Celsius by 2100, if all the pledges are fully implemented, which is warmer than the 1.5, which was first agreed upon at the Paris Agreement, or rather the Paris COP, through the Paris Agreement. So yeah, I think that's quite disappointing. There also wasn't a lot in terms of loss and damage, how to finance for loss and damage, particularly for more vulnerable countries, of which of course many are on the continent. But there were some good things which I think we'll speak to later. But I think, yeah, by and large, I think I was a bit disappointed by what came out of this COP.
Thank you, Shido, for your first insight in what you found was the COP like for you. So I can see there's been some things you've been okay with and some disappointments. So I would like to introduce to you now our next panelist, which is Vian Musica, and he's a resilience specialist and been spanning over 10 years of experience, and currently he's the renewable energy manager with a multi-actor partnership project, which is called 100% Renewable Energy for All. So this project is about simultaneously driving the global energy transition to eradicate energy poverty and promote prosperity. And the project aims to promote ambitious climate action and support sustainable development strategies in Nepal, Uganda, and Vietnam. And from your perspective, Vian, also being at the COP26 in Glasgow last week, and being a renewable manager in Uganda, from your participation at the COP, what is your impression? What has it been like for you?
Thank you. It was, first of all, for me, it was my first COP to begin with. So, and my expectation and the experience, really, the intuition I had in the inside of me is, why actually do COPs happen? Why do people go for COP? Why do we spend resources and time to have COPs almost every year? But for me, I realized the first participant at COP that really over and above and being fair is that COP provides a moment and an opportunity for upgrading our local, national, and global ambitions towards stopping the adverse of dangerous climate change. It just gives that opportunity of dialogue, that opportunity of discussion. So when we have different delegates, especially like from developing countries like Uganda, attending these meetings, like I was part of COP26, then.
Sorry, Vian, I'm not sure if everybody's having the same issue, but we can't hear you. Could you just...
for these communities who are...
Vian, can you hear me
now?
Yes, because we're breaking on and off. So maybe, can you just go back just slightly, because I think we were missing a part.
I was saying that for me, who was a first participant of COP and at COP26, clearly being fair, COP gives an opportunity. It gives a platform and moment for upgrading our local, national, and grow ambitions towards stopping the advance of dangerous climate change and its associated impacts. It gives that opportunity to dialogue. Now, for us developing countries who do not emit a lot but are affected by the effects of climate change, what this means is that our delegates, civil society organizations, and other partners and other actors, is that if we can translate these discussions at the global level into national level policies and plans, but much more importantly, into local level interventions that build or strengthen the resilience capacity of the communities that are affected by climate change. Now, as long as we attend COP26.
Oh, sorry, Vian, we're losing you again.
Good meetings, like what sessions and teams and civil. Do you hear me now?
Yes, now it's getting better again. So we're trying.
Yeah.
With the line is challenging for us today, but we are trying, and I think we try to get as much from you and from Uganda as possible.
Yes, I'm saying a meaningful COP26 to me is when these international level discussions translate into national level policies, allocation of resources, which also translates into resilience interventions at the local level that really will lead to that capacity that will lead to boosting the capacity of that local person, that local institution to be able to cope, to be able to adapt and mitigate adverse effects of climate change. So a meaningful COP is true representation of those local communities or institutions that are not able to be in Glasgow so that they can directly benefit. And therefore the linkage between the international level discussions that happen at COP and local level local level interventions and national level plans and strategies in regards to climate change is very critical for a meaningful COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veen. At the end, it was a stable connection. Maybe we keep on that. That would be great. Otherwise, we would give you a sign maybe to call again, to call in again. So maybe then the signal is better. We move on to our next panelist and our next distinguished guest, Dr. Garrett Hansen. She is Program Director Climate Change at the Robert Bosch Foundation in Berlin. She is responsible for developing and implementing the climate change strategy with a focus on sustainable land use and food system reform. Before joining the foundation in June 2021, she held senior positions at the German IPCC Coordination Office, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the environment and development NGO German Watch. Garrett has been working on climate change, sustainable development, and international climate policy for more than a decade. She also participated at the COP26, and I'm really curious about what is your conclusion? What took you with you from the COP26, and how is your conclusion about the agreement, Garrett? You are mute. You are mute.
Alex, 2 years into the pandemic and we still don't hit the mute button. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm actually with the foundation since June 2020. I probably made that typo myself when I wrote it up for you, but I wanted to correct that. So well, first of all, I think for COP26, I think it was really exciting for everyone to be back live with so many people. And honestly, I think that also helped to push some of the technical issues across the finish line. I also want to stress what Vian just said, that the COPs are really an opportunity of dialogue and cooperation. They're also a platform. They're not only a political body, but they're also a platform for non-state actors and state actors to meet and also to represent the interests of local people. And I think that is something that we have seen a lot of at this COP. We had a very strong indigenous peoples representation at this COP. We had very strong youth representation at this COP. And I think that those were also some of the factors that actually helped to what I would say is, and that's my first point, maybe a moderate success. Content-wise, I think it's really important to not phrase the COP as a binary issue, like kind of a big success or big failure. I would like to speak to 3 major priorities that I see at this COP. That was 1, the raising the ambition and mobilize support. Then also building trust in the multilateral process, and of course, finalizing the Paris rulebook. And if I start from behind, we did finish the rulebook. So now we have the technical guidelines in place to practically implement the Paris Agreement. And that was never a given. And additionally, those rules are, while not perfect, more robust than many have feared they might be. And they can be valuable tools moving forward. So together with the decision to come back next year with stronger NDCs and long-term strategies, with the emphasis that has been put on science and the first ever mention of fossil fuels in the United Nations context, I would say for the first point that is really kind of encouraging. And that brings me to my first item of the list, which was raising ambition and support. And I'd also say that we have seen quite a bit of progress there, where there were a lot of pledges. You may have read about all of them in the newspapers, great many pledges, governments, businesses, finances, and all sorts of multi-stakeholder coalitions that brought a lot of attention and progress also to very many areas. Just maybe if I would have to name a few, I would think the methane pledge is a really important step, not enough, but an important step. And also the renewed commitment to end deforestation in 2030 that has been signed by 120 countries. And this time is actually underpinned by roadmaps towards sustainable commodity supply chains from major agricultural and importers and many of the world's food industry giants. So that is kind of the difference between former pledges and that pledge. And that really gives me hope that this time around, we will really kind of act on it and actually achieve the goal of limiting, stopping deforestation. G20 and Glasgow pledges, we now together have almost 90% of the world's emission covered by net zero targets. And that is a huge step forward, which, like, if you would have told me 5 years ago that we would be here at this point in time, I think I wouldn't have been alone amongst experts to say, like, no, that's never going to happen. And so my last item was the trust in the multilateral process and in global solidarity. And here is where I would say that the picture, unfortunately, is still rather dire. We have on the plus side, as I just said, there is something on the plus side, which is that the Paris Agreement's bottom-up approach has just about passed its first test. It is kind of, you know, still squeaky and squealy, but the mechanism to ratchet national commitments until the common goals are met is kind of delivering. But on the downside, what we've seen in Glasgow is that vaccine inequality and its consequences for inclusiveness have really left a deep stain on the process. The fact that developed countries have still not fulfilled their promise to deliver the $100 billion in climate finance they've promised to the world's most vulnerable, and that they are holding really tight against legitimate asks to compensate for loss and damage, is not boding well with the majority world. And the disappointment of many in the global south, in particular on the extremely weak language on loss and damage that has really been voiced and felt very clearly at this COP. I also think on this last point, maybe there are some silver linings. The Scottish government sent a strong signal for climate justice with its £1 million pledge for loss and damage. We also have a clear pathway for global goal of adaptation, and I'm very confident that the Africa COP next year that is going to be led by Egypt will give those issues, adaptation, loss and damage, the prominence that they deserve. Just to, finish, I want to say that the industrialized world and the wealthy in general have a clear responsibility towards those whose development space, if not mere existence, is severely threatened by climate change. And I do think that at this COP, we have seen that they won't be able to pull out of that responsibility very much longer. So I'm optimistic, slightly optimistic, despite kind of ambivalent outcome.
Thank you very much, Garrett, for your for sharing your views. And yes, where there's hope and where there's still room for improvement. I would like to introduce now Julia Blocher to you, who is a doctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And she has published research on interaction, social, political, and environmental factors in human mitigation in the context of climate change. She's contributing to several research projects for the European Commission, International Organization for Migration, and others. And prior to joining PAIC, Julia was a project manager at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research in New York, a think tank within the UN system. Julia has lectured at universities in Europe and Africa, and she holds a master from the Sciences Po Paris and a bachelor's from the Johns Hopkins University. She also presented her results or her research at the COP26. So what do you think is, from your perspective, the outcome of the COP in Glasgow? Julia.
Thank you so much, Ika, and thanks again to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. Yes, I think I will mostly discuss a bit my perspective as a migration researcher, as I attend these COPs primarily to follow dialogues on migration and of course on displacement due to disasters, which of course we know that the majority of people displaced in the world today are displaced by meteorological disasters and no longer by conflict. But before I get to that, I wanted to add a little to what Chido and Dr. Hansen said about what I would call the mood music at the COP. This was my third COP, and I arrived expecting there to be a significant negativity because of the COVID regulations, because of the masking rules, and because of the difficulties of achieving an agreement at this COP. And I was positively surprised that it was more energetic than I had anticipated. So that being said, I agree with the previous speakers that it was really wonderful to have the opportunity to reconnect in person with this community and with the sub-communities, like, for example, the climate change and migration and displacement community that I am part of. That being said, I think there was also an element of exclusivity that was quite prominent. And of course, a lot of especially youth activists and indigenous activists pointed out. I would hope to see more participation online in the next COP. And of course, it takes some time to get used to these procedures. But given the restrictions around COVID and of course the restrictions that exist in any case around NGO accreditations, I found people were not able to enter rooms that previous COPs we had been able to enter and observe the discussions of the parties that at this time we were not able to. So hopefully going forward, more online engagement will be possible. That being said, I think while there was an agreement reached really in the final hours of this COP26, we saw a couple of key issues that I follow really fall short of expectations. And Dr. Hansen already mentioned that the issue of loss and damage was something that we really hope to see solid progress on, especially because loss and damage is something that is really critical for developing countries to see climate justice begin to be served. So for developed nations to ensure that adequate funding is available to developing countries to deal with the inevitable losses and damages of climate change, not just the financial and infrastructural, but also the so-called non-economic losses and damages like loss of cultural identity, loss of social cohesion that can result from the impacts of climate change, and also specifically from the impacts of migration that is induced by climate change. If a community has to be relocated from its ancestral land and people disperse to other locations, this can be considered by this community as to be a intangible but significant loss to cultural cohesion. So unfortunately, the text on loss and damage was significantly watered down. The parties who arrived from especially small island developing states and countries with significant coastal populations wanted to see a financing facility for loss and damage agreed upon. And the final text refers only to discussing arrangements for loss and damage. So this is obviously a bit less, a weaker way of addressing it. In addition to that, I think there was also a real hope of increasing ambitions on adaptation for developing countries to deal with the inevitable impacts of climate change. And this again is something that I think is really important, that developing countries and vulnerable communities in those countries that had the least to do with historical emissions and the least to do with the climate situation that we're in now are also those that are disproportionately affected by climate change. So it's really important in my view, and I agree again with Dr. Hansen on this, that developed countries step it up on financing for adaptation, financing for loss and damage, and not just making pledges, but also really turning these pledges into plans with concrete implementation agendas. So that's, I think those are the two issues I was mostly focused on. We still had, I think, really rich conversations about migration and about disaster displacement at this meeting, especially moving forward a number of conversations on intersectionalities. So in the case of people being poor and LGBTQI and women and marginalized in other ways, how are they disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change, and how does migration fit into that? I also would say that this was a particularly interesting COP because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and not just because of the impact on the delegates and attendees, but also that what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think was, it really exposed inequalities around the world between developed countries and developing countries, but also inequalities within communities inside of developing countries, inside of developed countries, and even inequalities between men and women of the same community. And these inequalities are the same that impact how people experience climate change differently. Specifically for migration, we know that because migration is an expensive venture that requires different financial and social capitals, very often women and the elderly are literally left behind and tend to find more negative experiences of migration as compared to working age men that are able to migrate. So what I think we want to move forward to very soon is a better understanding of how migration can be a positive adaptation strategy for communities affected by climate change, but more specifically, who and how can it be positive for everyone and not just specific resourced people within a community. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to discuss these points further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Before diving deeper into our discussion, I would like to ask our alums to participate and enrich our discussion via the chat. You're more than welcome to give us your comments and to ask maybe open questions. But to start with what we have said and what Julia just said, Chido, question for you. Germany's environmental minister has said that before the COP that South Africa's coal phase out has, quotation, the potential to become a blueprint for other regions. And the US and several European countries pledged billions on clean energy development. As we have heard from Julia, the pledge itself is not the solution. There needs to be a plan. Do you see that plan in international climate policy, or what would be your recipe to solve this dilemma?
Thanks, Marco. I think definitely the partnership that you're referring to, so it's between France, Germany, the UK, US, and the EU, who pledged $8.5 billion US in various forms of grants and concessional debt finance. And I think that is definitely an example of the kind of collaboration that is needed coming out of forums such as COP between and across regions. Because South Africa, as you said, mostly depends on coal. Over 80% of our energy comes from coal, and our electricity, over 90% of our electricity comes from coal. So we're a very fossil fuel intensive country. And in order for us to be able to decarbonize at a rate that's at a fast enough rate, given net zero commitments and also our commitments to the Paris Agreement, we need help, we need assistance. You know, the decarbonization is occurring, but without partnerships such as this, we would not be able to meet such commitments. So I think this partnership, this arrangement is key to helping to realize a just transition in South Africa. There's also another element to it, which this finance could help and might help as well. We're still waiting on the actual details, but South Africa's power utility, which provides most of the country's electricity, is heavily indebted. And so this money is seen also as a way to ensure its long-term financial sustainability in the context of power sector reforms. And then also we are hearing that the finance coming out of this partnership could also be channeled towards the development of electrical vehicles and green hydrogen sectors. And for example, the EV market in South Africa is, I mean, it's very, very small, almost insignificant. And so there are a lot of local level projects and detail that we are waiting to hear about that came out of this partnership, and we were told in the next 6 months that we'll get more detail. But it really is a critical example of the kind of commitments that are needed to come out of COP. And also the fact that although COP is a forum where like mainly the negotiations are being undertaken and text is being drafted, but those types of forums could also be used as a way to commit on other actions, not necessarily just the negotiations that happen. So yeah, it's a very exciting time for us in South Africa. And the next 6 months to a year, we are going to be sort of waiting with open ears to hear how exactly this finance is going to be made available and to which actors and all of that.
And allow me one question, like one after question, so to say. Are you optimistic for the development, especially in South Africa, where we've seen real huge problems of the national energy supplier and these things? Are you still optimistic?
I am cautiously optimistic. I think if I wasn't working in the energy sector, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I did. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think one thing that needs to be managed is domestic politics. I think there is a misalignment between the presidency and the energy ministry regarding the future of energy in South Africa, and also regarding sort of decarbonizing the economy. And really that's quite critical, because it's great to have a president who believes in a low carbon country or net zero country, really, but when you have an energy ministry leadership who still believe in this idea of clean coal, and I say that in inverted commas because but clean coal and sort of using gas as a transition fuel, that really is fundamentally quite problematic. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but we need to manage the politics within the country to make sure, especially with this finance that comes through, that it is being used in the correct and the most appropriate way in terms of moving us towards a net zero future.
Thank you. I have a question to Vian. Having the Uganda Vision 2040, which was implemented or introduced, not implemented, but introduced in 2013. From your perspective being in Uganda, and you also stressed on localization and implementation on the ground, what do you think of Uganda's way forward? Do you see also being part of a project which is very ambitious and is called 100% renewable? So do you see Uganda moving into a direction which is promising?
Absolutely, absolutely. I am naturally a solution. I'm naturally a solution-oriented person. Currently, the project I am leading, we are looking at 100% renewable energy transition for Uganda by 2050. And the importance of the map is to a multi-actor partnership is to kind of create a movement, create a people, both political and technical, that have a helicopter view of actually what does it take for us to begin to transition to renewable energy and at 100%. What are the considerations in place? What are the discussions we need to have? What policy shift or policy direction do we need to have? What kind of renewable energy access models do we have in place that fit the context of Uganda and other developing countries? And when we talk about renewable energy, what are we talking about? We are talking about simple things like energy for domestic use. And 98% of Uganda's population depend on biomass. They are looking at cooking, they are looking at lighting, but also that is really domestic use. But now when we also talk about energy for productive use, and what does it mean? And what is the best scenario, a renewable energy scenario or pathway that is going to lead us to a 100% renewable energy transition? And so when the issue of COP, and when we begin to talk about things like access to climate finance, simplifying the process of accessing climate finance, we are saying in the map and under this project, can we have a transition pathway for renewable energy for Uganda that fits into the context of Uganda, that meets the needs of the community, of the people in Uganda? And if Uganda and Vietnam and Nepal, then how can we replicate it in other least developed countries? What does it mean? So really trying to say in regards to renewable energy and sustainable renewable energy transition, we are looking at how can we walk the talk? How can we really be practical? How can we be relevant? How can we ensure that, again, I repeat, there is a policy shift in regards to renewable energy transition and sustainable renewable energy transition? How can we talk about increased resource allocation and funding in regards to renewable energy that meets the needs of Uganda and other least developing countries? How can we ensure that there is equitable renewable energy access, that the issue of women, youth, and children are considered in this discussion and this agenda? How can we ensure that there is consistent awareness raising, that a woman who spends 8 hours, for instance, for the case of Uganda, to look for firewood to prepare a meal for the children, we can have that time by maybe 4 hours. And so in this discussion, and being at COP26, and given that Uganda already has submitted its draft NDC plan and a long-term climate development strategy, which I am directly participating in and I'm a part of, is when we are talking about renewable energy, really being practical, that we move away from the boardrooms and begin to come out with practical solutions that inform real change on the ground. And again, when we are talking about, we've talked about Vision 2040. For Uganda and other developing countries, for Uganda and other developing countries, when we talk about sustainable development, when we talk about growing from where we are to a middle income status country, then the question of energy, the question of renewable energy cannot be left behind. It must be discussed, it must be dealt with, and practical solutions must be sought and put in place. And that's what we are dealing with here in the MAP project. And I'm honored to be part of a team that is leading this discussion in Uganda. And again, that is very, very important for us in the least developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one follow-up question. Did you have the feeling that at the COP, that your demand for and your lobbying was sort of heard and fell on open ears, or what was your personal experience? Was it difficult for you personally to lobby for the funds which you would need and for the understanding which your project would need?
Absolutely not easy. In terms of at COP26, especially for civil society, we all know that really we had limited access, inadequate engagement in terms of the proceedings at COP this particular round. But I have not lost hope still. I haven't lost hope that the discussion, and as my colleague Hansen shared earlier, is that I think we are beginning to see real discussions close to practical, close to being contextual, close to being relevant, close to practical solutions beginning to come out of these COP discussions. I think if we keep at the trajectory overall, we are going into the right direction, and we shall reach at a level where such a discussions even begin to come on the table. And when we talk about things like loss and damage, I mean, for us, for communities at risk, that's how they experience climate change, when they have lost their life, when they have lost their property, when they have lost their livelihood. That's how they relate with climate change. It is not science or something challenging for them. It is how they feel it, how they experience it, how they are living with it, how they are relating with the effects and the impacts of climate change. So when we have an opportunity like this discussion we are having today, at the end of the day, we would want to translate it into meaningful change, meaningful impact for those communities out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wien. When I hear you, when I've heard you write, I would say that pragmatic solutions are needed, and that to bring climate protection on the ground in the fields is needed. I would like to ask Garrett Hansen, Dr. Garrett Hansen, like, what could be concrete solutions? What could be done concretely from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And well, let me maybe give you just one example where I think that actually, kind of adaptation mitigation does come together very well, because as Vian just pointed out, it's also about climate resilient development pathways, and that means that you always have also in the age of climate change, you have to think about how can you adopt, how can you proactively think about, as also the other colleague said before, disaster risk reduction. How can we cope with the impacts of climate change, and at the same time make sure that we do not contribute to the problem. even further. And I think one of the areas where this can be done in a very great way is the area of nature-based solutions. So just to be very clear, I'm saying nature-based solutions is something that is complementary and in addition to very steep reductions in fossil fuel emissions. So that must be said always as the first thing. But nature-based solutions, I think, like restoring nature and working with nature to preserve biodiversity, to support and strengthen livelihoods, especially of rural populations, local populations in developing countries, also coastal communities, to make sure that the very, the natural resources that we all depend on at the end of the day are actually preserved and sustained. That is something where really a lot of really good work is being done, and where you can also work on all kind of levels, from the very local to the kind of national and global. One example where we are seeing really great progress at the moment is with the Africa 100 Restoration Initiative. So that's a forest restoration, landscape restoration initiative, where I think 32 by now African countries have pledged to restore like 130 million hectares across the African continent, and where a lot of actors, also think tanks and foundations and private companies, like eco-entrepreneurs, villages, communities, are really working on the ground to kind of to make that happen, and to kind of at the same time address social development challenges, but and questions of access, question of land tenure and equality, but also making sure that the carrying capacity of the natural ecosystem is being preserved, and that carbon is being stored. And so that is one of the examples where I think a lot of progress is being made at the moment, and where if we are really careful with the design, and with including really the local populations, making sure that land rights are kept, and that the local stakeholders, it's in their interest, and they're really part of the conversation and part of the way how we design the solutions, then this can really help bring forward and can be a multi-dimensional solution that actually works.
Thank you, Garrett. Maybe like this, more or less the same question to Julia, because we just heard, and you have pointed that out, that the climate crisis is amplifying social and environmental challenges and constitutes an increasing risk to the stability, and fosters migration and these developments. What we are now, like in this talk, we are now in the phases of trying to find solutions, or trying to find practical outcomes of to come out of this dilemma. What would be your answer? What could be a solution to solve these challenges?
Well, of course, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for this. So we'll need certainly a basket of solutions. But that being said, I think that what is really encouraging to me, and also going into the next year's COP in Egypt, is that for Africa specifically, addressing the issue of climate-related migration as well as displacement due to climate-induced disasters has really taken a forefront in a lot of policy discussions. There's I think, strong awareness amongst policy actors and practitioners, and also researchers, that this is a phenomenon that is occurring, and that more people are likely to be affected by climate change in the future, and more people are likely to be on the move as a result. But is something that already today we know that migration is something that is a positive adaptation strategy for many communities, especially in rural Africa, that moving from, for example, between rural areas for livestock or temporary labor migration in cities can be a way for communities to sustain their homesteads back home, especially through remittances, but also through social and political remittances. And this is something I've seen in my own research in East Africa, in particular that pastoralist groups will engage sometimes in temporary migration to tourist destination or to urban areas, and then remit back to their families back home and contribute to climate change adaptation and resilience building in their home areas. So migration really can be a positive phenomenon for developing countries, and also especially in Africa, even if up until recently, most policy texts that you'll read from African countries tend to refer to reducing migration pressures rather than embracing migration as a positive adaptation to climate change. This is changing now. We have greater recognition of this. And I think that after this COP, I was particularly struck by the fact that if we are not able to make reasonable solutions at the international level, it's time to turn to regional, national, and local solutions. And this is actually for migration and displacement quite an appropriate movement, because we know from empirical research that the vast majority of people who are moving because of climate-related events are staying either within their home countries or in some cases migrating across borders into neighboring countries. So when addressing human rights of migrants, making sure that migration remains a choice, also, of course, ensuring that livelihoods in origin areas can sustain people there, as well as ensuring that migration is something that contributes positively to household resources and doesn't become something erosive. All of those solutions need to be developed at the regional and national